That's Francesca, Maria, Taryn, and anybody else. Francis, thank you. And Stephen and Julia, thank you. You guys are ready? That is great. Okay, we can go ahead and kick off. We actually may be joined relatively shortly by an additional member of the Policy Roundtable, a late-breaking edition, which I think would be kind of helpful. But let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to do general introductions first because you know most of the members that we are welcoming, but we might, again, as I mentioned, have one more. So I'll just read through this, but I'll ask the folks who are new to the discussion to introduce themselves as well. So first, we do have Dr. Francesca Fumagalli, and you again can read her official affiliation and conflict of interest in this slide. Steve Young, or I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Would you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Stephen Jung. I'm a pharmacist by training with Blue Shield of California. I work in supporting our P&T process, and I'm really honored and glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know this is your first ICER meeting, so we'll try to be gentle until I ask you a probing question about coverage or something like that. So everybody gets equal opportunity to be slightly annoyed with my questions. That's our general ground rule. Maria has been with us from the beginning of the day in conversation. And Julia Mahler, would you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Julia, a pharmacist with IPD Analytics. IPD provides consulting services to a lot of different payers, and my hope here is to be able to communicate what I'm hearing from payers to you guys.
And that will be the questions I absolutely direct to you. Thank you for being with us. Now, Dr. Orchard may have had to leave at this point. He knew he was going to have to leave around the time we started, but let me just check to see if he's still with us. I do not think he is. But guess what? We have another clinical expert who's just parachuted in. There's got to be some good story about this. But her name is Dr. Laura Adang or Adong. I don't even know how to pronounce it properly. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. You're not on this slide. Those of us who've been here for the day's meeting, though, you will remember her from the video that was presented during public comment. Our team has also worked with her throughout the time of this review, but she didn't think she was actually going to be available. And so I'm really welcoming her, and then we'll get to the other folks. So Laura, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Laura Adang. I'm a child neurologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and an expert in MLD, and I care for many of the children around the country. So it is my pleasure to come and join.
Now, again, thank you I'm glad this worked out. As you can tell, we ask people to disclose any conflict of interest, and that can be academic, it can be financial. We saw some of your participation in the video earlier, but if you would, please let us know any relationships with industry or other reasons that you might feel like there's a potential influence on your judgment.
Yeah, I am a consultant for many of the MLD trials that have happened and are currently happening. So I am not a site of the Orchard Therapeutics trial because, of course, that was based only in Italy, but I have consulted with them. I also am a consultant for Takeda, who is an enzyme replacement therapy that has finished the trial, and we are a site for that study as well.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. All right, and Taryn is with us. So that is, oops, I'm sorry, Francis, I skipped over you. So Francis Pang, please introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for the kind invitation. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Francis Pang. I'm responsible for global market access at Orchard Therapeutics, and I have a background in health economics and genomic medicine. So very nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, and Taryn, that is our full complement. So we can take down this slide now, and we're going to dive in. We have about an hour and 20 minutes, which seems like a lot, but it'll go pretty quickly because we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. I want to start, we're going to get to all aspects of this. We're going to want to talk about screening, about education, about kind of clinical infrastructure. We're absolutely going to talk about coverage and pricing and payment options. And a lot of that could take a full day seminar by themselves. So we are going to try to cover a lot of bases. But I want to start by thinking broadly about access and equity in this context. And so let's start with screening, because screening is going to be an important part of making sure that all patients and families who can benefit from treatment have equal access to the ability to get diagnosed. So Maria, let's turn it back to you. Part of what we do on these roundtables is to identify actions that need to be taken by key stakeholders, government, associations, policymakers, what have you. So when we think about screening, what should happen next? And we may talk about some of the evidentiary issues, but from your perspective, from a policy perspective, what needs to happen to get screening right?
Well, I'm going to say that certainly RUSP is at the center of that in terms of expanded federal funding and a streamlined process that once the disease is approved by RUSP, that states immediately get the test up and running.
Can you tell people what that acronym stands for?
Oh, I'm sorry. A recommended uniform screening panel. So one of the most important efforts that Taryn and Dee will be leading will be the RUSP nomination process. So the minute the drug is approved, they will be submitting, I hope, an application for MLD to be screened nationally. But this is only a recommendation. Even if it gets through a very rigorous process by the federal government, it will take years for every state to screen. In the case of cystic fibrosis, it took 30 years for every state to screen for cystic fibrosis. So we are in a race against time in terms of making sure that geography does not dictate whether children get access to this therapy. And there are unique challenges in the tribal healthcare system in terms of whether or not at this point, to my knowledge, we've never treated an Indigenous child. The tribal healthcare system has its own rules and idiosyncrasies, bureaucratically speaking. So this is going to be a huge lift, but we're already seeing changes in Europe because of Dr. Fumagala and some really brilliant advocacy on the ground in Europe. England has really kind of begun to rethink newborn screening largely because of MLD and some of the patient stories and the work that's going on the ground in the EU. So I think the EU they've always looked to the US as being better, and the US really, actually, we have a lot of work to do on our end.
Fascinating. And so when screening, as you said, we did hear about the same things when we looked at spinal muscular atrophy and its gene therapy. I mean, it already had a treatment, though, with Spinraza that had been around for a little bit longer. But what's surprising to a lot of Americans is that it really is a kind of scattered process when newborn screening kind of gets picked up in different ways by different states and the amount of time it can take. So, but I'm glad you mentioned the tribal aspects, because I'm not even sure exactly who the decision makers are in Washington that would need to throw a switch to make that more available within, and they have to think about the whole package. It can't just be the diagnosis. It has to be, where do they get their gene therapy? Who pays for it? But someone has to get on that now. Are you or others talking to folks in that system?
Oh, absolutely. We have an amazing Alaska Native family who has begun these conversations, but they're particularly challenging because basically every tribe in Alaska has their own payer system. It's a very, very, very difficult system to penetrate. So the tribal leaders make decisions based on the needs of the patient community. And as you can imagine, the Indigenous populations in the United States and Canada have a lot going on in terms of priorities. And so even though the Alaska Native healthcare system ranks MLD as one of the most common genetic disorders in the population, it's been very difficult for those families to get access to people like Dr. Adang, and much less to get to Italy for treatment. So that remains a huge decision, which I think the tribal healthcare system and national leaders have to kind of work on together. But I don't know the answer. It's a remarkably challenging situation. Right now, the Navajo Nation is not approving any research. Their IRB has said, we don't want researchers in, and they're certainly deeply uncomfortable with genetic testing and genetic medicine, given a long history I don't need to lecture anyone here about. So it will be an exciting but challenging and historic moment.
Yeah, and I'm sadly ignorant of how their budget is done on a year-to-year basis, if it is done that way, and whether the idea of even having one or two patients treated would blow up their budget in a way that creates novel funding problems. Back to that general tension between doing really important good things for individual patients, but trying to figure out who needs to make a balance happen and where. So if we shift from screening, I think that was very helpful. What about just the general aspects? We talked about a bit, the infrastructure shift when there's a new treatment for a condition like this. Do clinical societies have to get out, the specialty societies, neurologists, do they have to get out and do any new education of your current practitioners to create referral networks? Does this happen through journals, through annual meetings, through APB bulletins? What happens when this treatment gets approved? Maybe I'll ask Dr. Adang this. Who has to do what to make sure that these patients, if the screening test is positive, what next, right? What happens?
Yeah, I think what we do is we work together as a community, and we luckily have a beautiful and tight-knit infrastructure among the MLD community, and really all the stakeholders. We've been working together for a decade plus, knowing that this hopeful moment where we have transformative therapies was on the horizon. So I've been doing an education tour of general societies, neurology societies, pediatrics. We've done radio shows, television shows, really just trying to get the word out about it, because you're right, it is rare, and we are going to change it. Just like SMA was something people hadn't heard of, we're going to very easily convince them that this was a rare disease they had never heard of that now is treatable. And so to me, it seems like a problem we have always gone through, where when we develop therapies for rare diseases, particularly as we move into newborn screening, we won't need people to have heard of it before and to think about it. We will be giving them the answer and the treatment at the same time.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Also, again, I am drawing many parallels with the SMA situation. Part of it was realization that Medicaid networks might need to have some special work done, because, I mean, a lot of children in this country are covered by Medicaid, and they have to make sure that they have the right specialists available to patients so that they can get connected quickly enough to have the right kinds of expertise. Anything further you'd want to say about the Medicaid angle on this?
Oh, I don't have a Medicaid angle, but I do want to say that the difference with SMA is that there is some inherent reversibility with Spinraza. I was on those original trials, and there isn't that with MLD. And so we won't be looking to providers to do the post-symptomatic or post-onset diagnosis. We really need newborn screening for maximal effectiveness of this therapy. So there isn't that reversibility, but there is a chance to really transform the trajectory in a way that I think in SMA is different as well. I think SMA was able to go to newborn screening as a later step, whereas with MLD, we're going to need that along with the therapy approval.
Although it's interesting, because we still got the sense that parents certainly felt like the clock was ticking, and there's nothing for a parent to feel like, every day the child could be getting worse in a subclinical way that needs to take, somebody needs to take action. But I hear what you're saying. Good. Taryn, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, in regards to Medicaid, one of the biggest hurdles we're going to have is that we need to get Medicaid to go across state lines for treatments, to go to treatment centers and things like that, because we've already run into that using with the leukodystrophy centers, going across state lines and getting it be a very difficult thing to do. So Medicaid's going to have to, there's going to have to be something placed in Medicaid that will allow a child to cross the state line to get this treatment.
Is it fair to say, and Taryn, you're the right person to respond to this in some ways too, let's assume that we do have newborn screening, a positive result. Is it fair to say it needs to be viewed as an action this day situation? That, health systems and insurers have to have systems set up so that there's just no dropped batons, no falling through the cracks, no 7 days and we'll hear back from you maybe. that the system really has to be oriented towards this as almost being an emergency that needs to have very, very rapid action. Is that a fair framing of the situation?
It is, and it's actually what happened with a case getting a bone marrow transplant. The hoops that had to be jumped through and things like that, and the child did not have time. It needed to be treated now. And so, yeah, those things have to be put in place.
All right. Let me switch over to the payer view of some of these things. We're going to get into the weeds of how coverage policy is written in insurance. And this is weird because we all live in the healthcare system and we all have, have insurance of different types. But the process for how insurance coverage policy is written is somewhat mysterious to a lot of people. But we're going to march through it and talk about some of the aspects of how the evidence is woven into those coverage policies. But more broadly, and Julia, maybe I can ask you across a lot of different payers, this is going to be a very expensive treatment. We'll come back and talk more about the price later. It's not going to affect that many patients on an annual basis. But what are payers, how are they currently handling this kind of new gene therapy for a relatively small population? What are you seeing as far as general approaches to setting up centers of excellence or, just general approaches to coverage? What's happening out there?
I'll start off with access to care. And I would say that starting off, a state Medicaid plan will try to have the treatment be given within the state. And if they can't, then that would be a situation where they would have to make an exception. And same with commercial payers. So commercial payers are going to try to have it be a network, but if they can't, because there aren't a lot of specialists, they're going to have to open up their network. As far as approach to coverage, I can say off the bat that payers are going to require prior authorization, and they're also going to limit this to a one-time treatment. I guess building from there, payers will definitely start with the FDA-approved indication as like the basis for their clinical criteria. And then from there, they will probably add on some of the inclusion and exclusion criteria that we saw in clinical trials.
We'll definitely be walking through those because, again, that's the part that people sometimes don't understand is what they cut and paste from the FDA label and what else happens as part of initial coverage in particular. Small employers, self-insured small employers. I've seen surveys recently that suggested that one survey suggested that 20% of the respondents were very seriously considering not covering any gene therapies, writing into their employee benefit design that they don't cover any gene therapies because they felt that that was the quote-unquote only way that they could really afford providing health insurance to keep the premiums down was to exclude a whole class of treatments like this. Are you very familiar with that as part of your work at IPD or not?
We have heard similar talks. I would say that for a small employer, the actuarial risk is really high. And then I'd also say even for like a local plan or something for example, this disease is more common in Native populations. So I could see a certain state Medicaid plans or a local plan in that area be concerned that they are going to get a lot of patients with this disease and have a very large actuarial risk. We've also seen payers talk about reinsurance, so essentially a supplemental insurance to try and cover these gene therapies. And then we also see payers, I guess this is a little off topic, but try to hire contractors to manage value-based contracts for gene therapies as a way to try to contain the costs.
Okay. I'm going to come back to this issue around excluding from coverage. Again, that's not the health plan that does that. It's the employer who chooses whether to do something like that. Another piece of the puzzle that a lot of patients certainly don't understand who's kind of making these kinds of decisions. But it's a real challenge for some of the smaller employers in particular. But as you can imagine, almost nobody views that as a good outcome. They don't want to exclude categories like this. But we're starting to see it in the marketplace, and it can create some real problems. going to come back to that later, actually, because Julia, you also mentioned the kind of centers of excellence, trying to set up a network. I wanted to ask Laura, sorry, to your knowledge, is this a treatment that can be provided by every neurology center, every other neurology center, 1 in 100 neurology centers? If I'm a health plan and I need to create my centers of people that I'll pay to do this, how narrow do I need to be? How broad do I need to be? What's your sense?
Well, lucky for us, there's actually existing networks. And so if you count the leukodystrophy centers, we have a large consortium of 8 of the major U.S. medical centers that are working together to better understand, study, and offer clinical care to children. And then it is also a metabolic disease. And so there's a robust metabolic disease network. And so between those 2 networks, which work well together, we've already begun offering gene therapy both through clinical trials and clinical care across a network of experts. There are some decreased coverage zones, right?
Yeah, some deserts, as we might call them.
Yeah, we have, I was trying to use a less inflammatory term, but yeah. No, there are some deserts. We are working as best as we can to make sure we have regional distribution. And I think we currently do. We don't have distribution in every state yet. But I think it's a big need and one that we have been aware of. And so we've been working to address. We are already starting to do gene therapies for this class of disorders, and it has been effective, and we haven't run into the same barriers thankfully that we're talking about now.
Yeah. Francesca, I see your hand up. I want to zip over to Francis to ask about this from the manufacturer's perspective, because I know you're thinking a lot about the future, and if this gains FDA approval, you'll want to try to hit the ground running with centers that know how to use it. What is your sense of the training or skill set that's needed to be able to deliver this? Is it going to be something that health plans are going to want to have just a few and they have to help people travel to them? Are they going to want to have one in every zip code? What are you thinking about from where you see the landscape?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Steve. So certainly, as Laura sort of mentioned, we do have a network of qualified treatment centers, and these treatment centers really kind of leverage their established expertise in stem cell transplantation and also their kind of clinical expertise in neurometabolic disease, right? So, there is quite an intensive process in terms of qualification because, it is quite a complex therapy. You want to be able to administer it correctly, but also ensure safety as well. So, the qualification does include, things such as, looking at the collection of cellular source material for subsequent manufacture and administration, looking at whether the site actually has the necessary infrastructure and the established sort of site practices, making sure that the regulations are complied with, as well as looking at product-specific shipping and logistics as well as product-specific training. You're absolutely right, Steve, in terms of patients are likely to have to cross state lines, right? And you have the cross-state Medicaid certainly issue. And I think here, the provider has to be registered in other states outside of the home state, right? And certainly there could be certain concerns such as, travel concerns for the patient and caregiver. And then this could be compounded by sort of lengthy approvals. This can be certainly quite important, certainly as you heard earlier about the narrow treatment window, for patients, and also the reimbursement may not be consistent from state to state. So certainly at the outset, as we have also done abroad as well, we have a few qualified treatment centers initially, and then we kind of look to kind of expand this network over time.
I do have a further question. I don't see Francesca's hand at this point. Did we get to your point, Francesca?
Yes, Francis covered what I was asking or want to comment.
I wondered between Laura maybe and Francis, so let's assume we have a Medicaid patient. Now, if we assume that they need treatment across state lines, Is this something that their home state Medicaid needs to create as a policy, that they can travel and it doesn't matter as long as it's a Medicaid physician in another state that they can, or is it something that the doctors in the other state have to do to register to be able to provide care for patients coming from the home state? Who's actually responsible for taking what actions to make this system work?
I'll take a first pass, Francis, and then you can take your perspective. So, I mean, this is already something where we realize we have regional hubs of expertise in the leukodystrophies. And so I see patients from around the world, and I have registered with programs in many, many states, and actually I'm in licensed in multiple states at various times in my career for that reason, to be able to accommodate a population that we know is diverse and coming from many geographic regions. I think as we create regional hubs throughout the United States that are qualified to administer this project, we can just make sure internally that we have all the states covered by all of the hubs that are established. And that seems like a fairly feasible and an easy step. And maybe I can't see a patient from one state, but my partner in another state or region can. And so I think we would just need to work together to create that map.
Isn't it funny, we have this national system called Medicaid. Well, it's not a national system. That's the whole point. I can just imagine a patient showing up. Who's got Arkansas? I don't know. How about you? No, I hope that, so it doesn't sound like Medicaid, though, needs to lift a finger, honestly, because they're not creating a barrier that at least they can address. It really is on the doctors, the center's responsibility to get someone, as you said, accredited in each of the states. Is that fair?
That is my perspective, though I'm sure there's others from the insurance standpoint that feel differently.
All right. And I think, Stephen, you're the only one I haven't picked on yet, so your turn is coming. You can stay tuned. Maria, yes, you had your hand up.
I just wanted to bring up that, in fact, the rules for Medicaid are quite problematic for gene therapy. For example, Texas has a rule, and Victoria Raspberry, whom you heard from, could speak to this, where the children have to present with clinically recognizable symptoms in order to be eligible for Medicaid. So her son, Ollie, was not even considered for Medicaid, and many SMA families were not as well, because they were identified so early in the disease progression that the symptoms were not to the bar that Medicaid required in terms of seizure activity. So the Medicaid system will need to be reevaluated, and this is a huge challenge moving forward for gene therapy and pre-symptomatic or early symptomatic, whatever, subclinical symptomology, whichever language you all prefer to use.
All right. Actually, I like your introduction of early or preclinical. That's another way to say pre-symptomatic in a way. Stephen, Blue Shield of California, large regional payer. Does your market extend beyond California, or are you all in California? I forget.
It's all in California.
Okay. So you already have a centers of excellence network of some kind set up for gene therapy, right?
Yes, we do. Typically in the large cities of the Bay Area and LA.
So if you see this product coming down the pike with likely FDA approval first quarter next year, what do you need to do ahead of time to get ready, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, we're typically engaging with our partners in industry, getting a sense of where those networks are already established. Typically, it's continuous with the sites of investigation for the pivotal trials. We are also, I'm sure we'll get to this in a bit, but just entertaining value-based or outcome-based types agreements, and also just a lot of pre-approval information exchange as well to really be proactive so that we do have policy in place upon approval.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned value-based agreements. We are coming back to that for sure. I want to raise one aspect of how payers approach especially expensive new treatments that has become a bone of contention, certainly in some communities, and that's the new to market block. That's the jargon that implies that a health plan will take anywhere from 3 months to 6 months to basically make an official coverage policy. Originally, this was stipulated as giving them time to look at the evidence and to kind of make sure that they're getting it right. But some patient groups are concerned that it's just a way to slow things down and they get stuck waiting for an individual approval as opposed to having a set policy that just kind of speeds things along. So I think, Stephen, you may have heard some of the discussion around how this kind of feels like an emergency, given that, the neurologic effects are probably accumulating, even if they're not fully symptomatic yet. Well, what's your thought on the general approach to using new-to-market blocks? You don't have to talk about what you're going to do with this particular product, but do you see that as an issue around how health plans in general need to think about treatment for this kind of condition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that consideration is certainly contextual, and at least based on a condition like this, where early treatment is tantamount to really optimizing outcomes, that payers ought to be aware just to their preparations to really have something in place and not have to resort to that sort of approach to managing it. That's not to say that it won't be used, but I would say that it would be inappropriate considering the nature of treatment as well as the burden of illness.
Thanks. Julia, maybe quickly back to you on this, because you can speak more generally about the whole landscape of payers. Would you expect a fair number of them to have a new-to-market block on this treatment when it gets approved?
I would say across the board, we see more and more payers just requiring a new-to-market block on all drugs, right? Just having it be their policy. However, in the case of something urgent like this therapy, one of the Duchenne's therapies, they have a medical necessity review process where they will still review it before it goes to P&T and has a criteria in the case that it's urgent, such as this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
An exception process, essentially.
Yes. I mean, I've heard some what I would call horror stories when you would think that a new-to-market block doesn't make sense. It also, I think, it puts a certain amount of responsibility on health plans when you can see this treatment coming months in advance. I mean, for some, it might be a close call whether it will be approved or not. For others, like this one, it seems, certainly if you go by the votes that our crew took, our independent appraisal committee, this is likely going to be a relatively straightforward approval from the FDA. So it's coming. And the idea that you need an additional 3 to 6 months after that to kind of put the wheels in motion feels unnecessary. So we have actually put in our policy recommendations before that health plans should be very aware that this is coming, that it's a treatment is very, very likely to be approved for a condition that is kind of rapidly progressive in a way that they really should move heaven and earth not to have a new-to-market block that would affect patients. Anybody want to disagree? Probably not. All right. So we're going to move forward to start to talk about some of the more specific aspects of coverage policy. And forgive me for looking down at my notes, but what I have are the label from the European Medicines Agency, so we can kind of reflect a little bit on what that label looks like. Doesn't mean that it's going to be the exact same label in the US. And I have the inclusion and exclusion criteria from the key trial. And so again, as Julia mentioned, the way that kind of the standard approach is health plans will start with the coverage policy, start with the FDA indication, and then they will also look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria from the key trials. And they may say, well, the FDA approved it for everybody, but the clinical trial only involved people over the age of 25. So we're going to say that our coverage is only for people over the age of 25. Now, sometimes that use of the clinical trial information, clinicians will say, yes, that seems completely reasonable to only think of this treatment for the patients who were in the trial with this kind of set of characteristics. And sometimes they feel like, well, the clinical trial was set up in a certain way, but it doesn't mean that, patients who are a little bit different won't potentially benefit. So I want to talk a little bit about where some of those gray zones might exist in the way that health plans will write this policy. We don't have the FDA label, but we can walk through the different categories of what they will look for and think through a little bit about some of the pros and cons about how insurers will put this together. Now, Francis, as you said, you guys have been having discussions already with major payers in the U.S., is that correct?
Yeah, yes, we have been having sort of discussions, with payers, as part of the preparation for the potential BLA approval. So, I think first and foremost, right, I mean, ICER has been studied in the early onset population, right, namely the late infantile and pre-symptomatic and early symptomatic, early juvenile, right, and that's what the indicated population is in Europe, and we are kind of expecting the FDA label to be along similar lines. But it's only just about 2 weeks ago that we actually had our BLA application accepted, and it's under review. And but that's all we know right now. We're kind of expecting the covered population to be very similar to what we have in Europe.
Thank you, by the way, because I know with your BLA kind of under consideration, it's hard for you sometimes to talk freely about the what ifs of everything. So I appreciate your willingness to do that. So let me just march through again some of the major categories. The diagnosis of the condition, how it's diagnosed, I don't think that's going to be controversial in terms of how the health plan coverage is written. There's a very clear kind of criterion for the use of the kind of blood test, genetic test to identify patients who would qualify. The more complicated thing could be in terms of the clinical categories, the subpopulations. Most health plans will have an age kind of part of their coverage criteria, like it's only covered for people over the age of 18 or ages 5 and over or that kind of thing. But I wanted to just kind of confirm that my view, which is when you look certainly at the European label, the regulatory label, it doesn't talk about age. It talks about the clinical kind of subpopulation, whether there are symptoms or not, kind of whether it's early or late infantile. They don't say 7 months and above or something like that. But if you look at the clinical trials, you can find out who was the youngest patient treated. And I asked my staff, and I believe it was 7 months. Francesca, you will know this better than anybody. And so my assumption is that trying to use specific age cutoffs within these kind of clinical categories is not going to be something that health plans are going to want to do. But if they were going to try that, tell us whether you think that's a reasonable thing to consider or not, whether there should be an age cutoff, because the treatment involves, the busulfan and other kinds of things. Is there any, with newborn screening, is there any age that's too young to get this treatment? How do we know? Francesca, what do you think?
Thank you for the question. It's a very tricky point. There are a lot of discussion ongoing in Europe between different centers. In fact, this is only a technical reason, the age of treatment. In fact, you have to collect the stem cells from the patient, and below a certain weight, it is very difficult to collect cells. So the lower weight, it has been collected cells in the commercial setting in Europe is above, I think, 5 kilos. In our center, 7 kilos. So it's even not the age, but weight of the patient, because the machine of apheresis can collect safely cells above a certain weight of the child. I would say as soon as possible in case of patients identified during newborn screening, but usually is around 6 to 7 months old. It should be earlier for late infantile, expected late infantile. It could be a little bit later for early juvenile, but I would, as soon as possible is the right answer. Do
you mind? All right, that's really helpful. Is there any age at which it's too old? I mean, I know that's probably just a figment of the patients who've been treated so far, but the oldest juvenile treated, I believe, began treatment at age 11. Francis, feel free to jump in if you feel like you want to comment on this too. But I would assume also that there may be some, as you said, some other clinical reasons why you can't go too young or too small. Is there any reason that the juvenile should have an age cutoff for treatment?
In fact, not, because the criteria is not entering in the rapid phase of disease progression, and the early juvenile variant is a little bit more heterogeneous, and the phase of stagnation before a rapid decline can be a little bit more heterogeneous. There are the patients that enter the rapid phase of progression at 5 years old, some at 7, but in the case of this patient, it was still stable at 11. It was judged from a medical point of view, still in a phase that could be treated with a good IQ, good capability to walk. And in fact, we saw great benefit in this subject. So I would not exclude the patient because of being too old.
Yeah. Laura, anything you want to add from your clinical experience?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Fumagalli is the world's expert on that, so I defer to her, but I agree. I think the only thing I would gently push back is in the early juvenile and late infantile forms, it is a much more stereotyped and predictable course. And so while I wouldn't put a very firm age cap, I think the disease naturally puts an age cap on it. So we are not talking about someone with an early juvenile form that is presenting at 16 years or 20 years of life. We're talking about actually a fairly narrow window in variability within those disease states. So it is a strength and a challenge, I think, with defining the subtypes by age at clinical decline.
So, and boy, I hope I'm not making any mistakes with this, but those of you who are fluent on a daily basis with these clinical subpopulations, the early, late, symptomatic, not symptomatic, if I ever make a mistake, flag me down. But symptomatic late infantile and symptomatic late juvenile were not part of the clinical trials, and they're not part of the EMA label in Europe. So I'm assuming that they will not be part of the FDA label either. Are there any clinical situations in which you would feel that you're going to want to ask for an off-label use, if you know what I mean? Are there any patients who, for whatever reason, were not included in the clinical trials that you are going to feel like actually they're a good candidate for treatment? Anything at all that sticks out in your mind? Laura?
Yeah, I think one important challenge we're going to have is when children have comorbidities and perhaps they can't meet the motor criteria or the cognitive criteria because of an underlying static disorder. I think that is a challenge for equity reasons we need to address and be willing and able to mobilize gene therapy in cases like that, where a child maybe doesn't meet the motor criteria, but maybe they have cerebral palsy on top of their MLD. And so I think there are potential exceptions I can think of off the top of my head.
Well, that sounds like a tough situation to suss out. Taryn?
And Laura, I'd also like to ask about a late juvenile that's diagnosed with newborn screening. Do you see them by chance getting off-label use so that they don't develop late infantile or late juvenile MLD?
Would you like me to take that, or can I pass that to Francesca, who has an open late juvenile trial?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll go ahead. You go ahead. I can say that from a real world politic aspect, health plans are not going to cover anything that's off-label for a treatment, certainly that does have some risks, and certainly with this expense. They will watch the evolving evidence, and we will certainly encourage that they do so, because in this kind of situation, we may learn that there are additional populations that can benefit. But they're going to be very conservative in the way that they write their language to capture the patients who've been studied so far. But Francesca, please feel free to tout your study if you like.
There is a study ongoing on the late juvenile population, just because the European Union asked to collect data on late juvenile group. But in fact, there is no reason to think that this kind of therapy would not work in late juvenile group. because the mechanism of action is the same. And moreover, I think sometimes allogeneic transplant is considered a good alternative option for the late juvenile group, but we have to remind us that some patients could not have a good donor. So there could be patients that could not have access to allogeneic transplant. So we have to think that they have no treatment in this case. So I would like to think about offering this kind of treatment at least to patients with no access to allogeneic transplant.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll come back to stem cell transplant from an insurance perspective too in a minute. I also wanted to, oh, I'm sorry, Laura, did you want to follow on? Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up on the really important point that Francesca brought up about equity and access. And so if you look at transplant availability in the older population, the LJ and adult population for MLD, we don't have the same ability to use families because many times our families are carriers, right, in our rare diseases. Plus, if you look at availability within the match system, it can be as high as a third of some minority groups, African Americans, do not have a match within the system. So I think for equity and access, I think it becomes a pressing issue to be able to use this autologous stem cell transplant mechanism so that everyone has an opportunity for transformative therapy. I think that was one of the reasons that ALD and its gene therapy was so successful, even though the efficacy data behind ALD bone marrow transplant is much better than it is for MLD. But again, that equity and access issue, the idea I could identify someone on newborn screening and then them not have a match, even though I knew ahead of time, to me is just morally and ethically reprehensible. So I thank you, Francesca, for bringing up that important point of really many children do not have bone marrow transplant matches.
And I was going to bring it up later, but I'll just hit the same nail. Stem cell transplant is $1 million, we heard earlier today. And in some situations, health plans will say, is there anything else that the guidelines suggest as a potentially appropriate treatment that patients should try first before they get something else that's either more expensive or more risky or whatever else? I'm assuming that you would feel strongly that it would be inappropriate to require consideration, or would you want a health plan to say stem cell transplant comes first if they're eligible or available or anything like that? This is not, and just say a little bit more about why, from a clinical perspective, that would not be appropriate. Laura?
Yeah. Bone marrow transplant is not effective in the early onset forms of MLD.
Full stop. We heard that as much earlier today. And so I just wanted to make sure that we kind of captured that for the record, if you will. Taryn?
I think you also have to look at bone marrow transplant in the late juvenile, the outcomes versus the outcomes that are happening in the gene therapies. My daughter died from a bone marrow transplant back in 1995, even though she engrafted and her bone marrow or her BMT was considered a success because she produced the ARSA enzyme, but she died from complications of the chemotherapy and everything that's used. The chemotherapy regime that was used on her is not the same chemotherapy regime that's used in the bone marrow transplant, and you're using your own cells carries a much lower risk than using donor cells. So I think all that needs to be considered as well.
Got it. All right, I want to round back and I think close off some of the discussion around the coverage criteria, how it will be considered and written, to talk about the early juvenile, early symptomatic population. The European label said that it's only indicated for those who still have the ability to walk independently and before the onset of cognitive decline. both of those are fairly if you're trying to write criteria of how you will know whether that's true or not, what is any cognitive decline, some measure of cognitive decline. The ability to walk independently is probably a some days yes, some days no situation for some kids. I'm not sure what the FDA label will look like, but this idea that they have to be early symptomatic and not late symptomatic, what's the cut point? If an insurance company wants to try to write a standard for what's too symptomatic, how should that happen? How should that work? Francesca or Laura, I mean, are you happy with the way the Europeans worded this? Are there different ways to think about how to draw that line of where symptoms are too much to be eligible?
From a medical point of view, it is really difficult to put a straight cutoff and a straight threshold to select patient and to make patients eligible to a treatment or not. But what we have learned that, it is well defined and agreed also between MLD experts, is that the patient should have a gross motor function classification level 0 or 1. That is a standard validated measurement of motor function in MLD and used across MLD center internationally. So meaning normal gait or impaired gait, but still able to walk in the daily life. Regarding IQ, we use the cutoff of 85. That means really in the normal range of IQ. This is what we consider in the label in Europe, and I think it is for now the right cutoff because we have seen that going below 85, we are moving to this phase of decline.
Right. And Laura, does this connect back to your earlier comment about kids with other conditions that might inhibit their motor function, maybe even their mental situation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that I think Francesca's trials are beautifully designed and they inform what I consider to be minimally symptomatic. And so I agree with that. I think the difference, though, is in a real world setting, we are looking for this therapy for the next generation of children, the children that are defined and found pre-symptomatically, at which point the 85 matters less. It matters much more the change. And what you want is to capture children and intervene before they have a change. And if someone is 70 and has stayed a 70, that means something very different than someone whose IQ was 100 and is now 80 or 85 and still within the range. And so because we're going to be able to pre-symptomatically identify these children, and just as we have for other leukodystrophies and neurometabolic disorders, follow them longitudinally looking for change or evidence of when to intervene in more ambiguous cases, I think we have the infrastructure to deal with that already. And those would be the exceptions where I would honestly argue tooth and nail that if a child is stable, the number doesn't matter. It really is the disease affecting brain function to me.
Let me reflect back to Stephen or Julia from the payer perspective. When you hear that kind of nuance from a clinical expert, does it make you think that, the right approach should be to craft the coverage policy very loosely, if you will? Or do you want to go ahead and use clinical trial criteria and have a quick exceptions process? How do you want to address the kind of nuance that Laura just mentioned?
Yeah, I think I want to acknowledge the complexity of that. I mean, I think for one, it's it strikes me as quite probable that many payers will look at the criteria and simply just copy it into their policies, and I think they'll basically justify that on the rationale that there's a paucity of data in that setting, that the nature and intent of treatment is likely past the window if they're at that point. But I think the other thing, though, is when we consider the burden of illness, how rare the condition is, and that if there is an established network already of centers of excellence where it's specialists who are primarily the ones who are managing this, that there also is the chance that some payers will take the route of really deferring to their expertise and allowing for some of those scenarios.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Julia, anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Stephen. There will be a range of what payers do. So as less restrictive, they'll kind of refer to provider attestation that the patient does not show cognitive decline and can walk independently, versus a more restrictive payer could require some more documentation of IQ score or any of these motor function scores.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I guess I would say is that, I listened to the manufacturer call on that gene therapy for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, which is kind of similar. And what they said was that they didn't have any ultimate denials from insurance companies on their therapy yet. And I think what that tells me is that, most of the patients who are trying to get this therapy are the right patient. They are clinically appropriate for therapy. And, I think that payers are going to require prior authorization no matter what, but I can't really see these getting denied in many situations, if that makes sense. Either maybe an initial denial and then it gets approved on appeal, or these are just meeting the clinical criteria that the payers are putting out.
Great. Thank you, guys. That's very helpful. I think I've covered, there are a few minor issues that we'll probably put into the final review, a final document about some minor issues. We will mention the fertility preservation aspects. That was even part of the label in Europe, that it needs to be considered. And from a payer perspective, just know that there will be kind of some wraparound issues in terms of travel potentially. If they have to travel across state lines for families, there'll be issues that come up with other kinds of rare diseases where they have to kind of face those situations. But I want to come back to this idea of when it's not paid for at all. And again, this wouldn't be a health plan, an insurer doing this. It would be a self-insured employer who owns and operates, if you will, the benefits for their employees. It doesn't have to be an employer. It can be a union. It can be others that sponsor health insurance. Francis, what would you say in general, if you have a patient who is an employee of an employer, let's say, who is not covering any gene therapies, and newborn screening is in place, and this pops up, do you as a company have an approach to help patients or do anything in that kind of situation?
It's certainly early days. We are looking at, in exploring sort of patient assistance programs, but I think, if there's any kind of, we do actually have a policy on compassionate use requests actually, which is published online, right? So, I guess, the provider would have to kind of refer to that, and that's what would have to happen.
I don't even know if you are the right person to try to answer this, but obviously if I'm an employer and I know that if I say no to gene therapy, the companies will help the patient get it anyway, that they'll basically come in and pay for that patient to get it, and I don't have to as the employer. It kind of creates an incentive almost for employers to not cover gene therapies if they know it's going to be okay anyway. Julia, any experience so far that you've heard of from the broader set of plan sponsors and how this is being addressed with other gene therapies from which we can draw any lessons?
I would agree that that's obviously a very controversial thing to do, to exclude all gene therapies. And then obviously you could, see as a result, an increase in medical costs because these patients are going to get sicker. So maybe even from a financial perspective, it's not that wise. But what I have heard is that for those people who do exclude gene therapies, they're pushing patients towards the manufacturer patient assistance programs. And then also, I'm not sure if that patient could, because they're a child qualified for Medicaid, so sort of pushing to the state Medicaid plan as well. But I'm not an expert in that.
Yeah. Stephen, any experience dealing with plan sponsors? I don't know if you guys work with plan sponsors who might not cover gene therapy.
What I've heard, I think that's certainly been discussed, but I don't think it's arrived at the point where it's actually been done. I think the the traditional route of coverage has still been maintained, at least up to this point.
Okay. So let's shift to a more optimistic side of this coin to a certain extent. But Francis, back to you. So you saw the ICER evaluation. You saw that what we call our health benefit price benchmark range from 2+ million up to almost 4 million. You guys going to be okay with that? You guys, do you feel like the incentives for innovation, even for a very small patient population like this, is that adequate? If you were to price somewhere in that range, does that represent a business model that works?
It's a bit certainly, I think it's a bit too early to comment on the price in the US, and I think we'll provide more specifics on the price closer to the the PDUFA data. And but certainly, we do, look, we are certainly sort of believers in evidence-based medicine, and certainly have appreciated the work that ICER has been doing in terms of evaluating and assessing a transformative therapy such as OTL-200 or Arcicel for MLD. Certainly, we've been sort of encouraged by some of the methods, right, that were mentioned, in the presentation, certainly this morning. And certainly, I think it's really important to think about the value from different perspectives, right? So it's not just the patient, but also the caregiver, society as well. And I think we've also worked very hard to look at that value, right? And we've done caregiver surveys. We did a number of utility surveys. We also measured disutility in caregivers as well. So I think certainly there's a lot that sort of goes into when it comes to arriving at the price, and certainly we'll provide more information as soon as we get closer to the BLA submission. But this is certainly a useful data point, I would say.
So we are obviously, in our methods, we certainly talk about the clinical effectiveness data, and its relative certainty and strength, before we, in a sense, wrap into the cost effectiveness. But as you know, some people would say, well, value is all well and good, but the value of a cup of water to a person in the desert is infinite. And we wouldn't want to say that a fair price for that cup of water should be whatever that person's willing to pay for it, because it'll save their life and help their family. That we should figure out how to pay for something at a rate that adequately rewards the risk and investment of the company and gives them a fair profit on top of that investment. But we don't want to give them all the value, that somehow that is overpaying for something when we have other needs in the health system, other needs even outside the health system. Do you have any just general philosophical reflection on the concern that as we pay for value, it seems fine, but then we end up with some numbers that make people really just shake their heads and say, what are we doing?
Sure. So, I think as what came across in the economic presentation this morning was the large number of quality adjusted life years. And I think there was certainly a piece of research that was done by the NICE Decision Support Group at University of Sheffield that looked at the technologies over the past 20 years that had the highest quality adjusted life years, of which you had, a range from something like 2 through to 18.8 or around there. And, OTL-200 actually exceeds the top end of that particular range. So it is a very transformative therapy here. And certainly it's certainly important that, the value is sort of reflected. And, certainly, I think we're quite confident in the value.
So translated into American vernacular, you guys have hit more home runs than Babe Ruth, in a sense. You're top of the charts with the measured impact on health gains.
Yeah.
And that's a fantastic outcome for patients and everyone. And I mean, it's worth doing even a little bit of math on this, so that if I think there are estimated to be 2,500 patients with MLD in the US. I don't know what the global number is. You probably do, Francis. What's the global number?
Yeah, so actually the global instance number that we're using is 1 in 100,000. We do believe that the number that was presented this morning, is a typo, and we'll certainly look to correct that. But it's more like in the magnitude of about 30 to 40.
Thousand.
No, not thousand.
30 to 40 all told in the U.S.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. So
okay, well that was either a big typo or something else going on. Maybe what's the global prevalence?
Yeah, so as I said, I mean, we haven't extrapolated the numbers, right? I mean, but as I said, the instance number that we're using is 1 in 100,000. Perhaps Francesca and Laura could certainly attest to any other information that they may have actually on the epidemiology, for this ultra rare disease. So, yeah.
Well, I don't go down too much of a rabbit hole. I was actually fishing for a way to make a point, so I'll go ahead and make the point anyway. The point is, I did some back of the envelope because we do think a fair amount about whether the value-based price is scaled in a way to reward innovation and create incentives for other work of this kind. Because for years there was a problem that there wasn't an adequate business model for ultra-rare condition treatments, but we now seem to be in somewhat of a new era. But anyway, I took just half, so this could be completely off target now, but if you take half of that 2,500 number and you multiply it by 2.8 million, not saying that that's going to be your price or anything else, but you do get 3.5 billion. So it becomes a blockbuster and then some. And so I mention that sometimes because it is a sign that there's enough reward if we do price to value, even for ultra rare conditions. Sometimes it seems to make it work as a business model. And the other thing is that for people who wrestle with even the high sticker price of the one-time treatment, we have done our own kind of back of the envelope math that if you do value-based pricing, just even in a narrow set of conditions like cystic fibrosis and autoimmune diseases, you would actually, if you will, be able to reduce prices to a value-based price that would easily pay for the high, prices that we are asking of these one-time gene and cell therapies. Yeah. So there's a kind of a balance, if you will, throughout the system that is at least possible.
Yeah, so certainly the 3.5 billion is not a number that we are certainly familiar with. It's certainly very, very far off, and just to give you some kind of perspective, right? We have a sort of an instance that's 10 times less than SMA, right? And we're ultra rare, so that is very, very, very far off. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about outcomes-based agreements. Stephen, you mentioned that this is something that you are already thinking about, right?
Thinking about, yes.
I would posit that this is a really challenging condition in which to do it. You're stabilizing. So how do you know exactly when the patient is or isn't getting benefit from the treatment? Obviously, if they end up getting much, much worse, you could say, well, clearly that didn't work. But Stephen and between Stephen or Francis, is this condition and this treatment ripe for outcomes-based contracting, or is it just too small and the trajectory of treatment outcomes is such that it doesn't make sense to try to track it over years? Or is it a condition in which you would offer a warranty or some kind of rebate if the patient doesn't do well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I just want to clarify that with respect to the condition itself, it doesn't seem to be perhaps the best candidate for that type of agreement as it would with other gene therapies in general. For one, there's at least yet there hasn't been any indication of some sort of treatment failure after receiving it the way there may have been with other gene therapies that may not have had a long-term duration of effect. I think the other thing, though, is to your point, is what sort of outcomes would be appropriate to track. And for one, it's difficult to track a condition that's degenerative by nature. So most likely, if there were anything, it'd be more of a warranty type arrangement is what I would expect in the case of failure, but not so much based on outcomes.
So Francis, I'm sure you're well familiar with our crazy U.S. healthcare system and how different payers will want to do it differently. Are you engaged in at least considering outcomes-based contracts of one kind or another, or have you decided that this isn't a good situation for that?
Yeah, so we have experience actually of outcomes-based contracts, certainly abroad, and I don't know how relevant that would be for the United States, and certainly in sort of broad terms, they have kind of measured outcomes related to some of the aspects that you've talked about today, the motor and the cognitive aspects, right? But I think the real issue, as what Stephen mentioned, is really the operationalization of it and whether it's actually worthwhile. And from our experience, in some instances, payers have talked about in Europe have talked about outcomes-based agreements, but ultimately decided not to pursue it. So, I think we're confident in the benefits of ICER for MLD, and to date, we've actually not had to have any kind of rebate for any kind of missed outcomes in an outcomes-based agreement.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you if there are any publicly kind of known outcomes agreements framed with the European systems at this point. Do they have outcomes agreements with you?
Yeah, well, the details are actually quite for the confidential to the payer concern. So unlikely to be in the public domain.
But whether you have one or not, is that publicly known or not?
Yeah, we have articulated that we do actually have been working on these outcomes-based agreements. Yes.
Okay, so I mean, I think of the Germans and the English and who else covers it? Italy at this point, right? I mean, or a lot of members of the EU. How many do you have?
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head actually, but we do actually have a few, yeah. In operation. Yeah. So
with what you can make publicly available, if you were advising payers in the US based on your experience over 3 years in Europe, what lessons have been learned about patient access schemes they call them schemes, at least in England. So it sounds a little nefarious in US, but what have you learned about patient access schemes, whether they do seem to be worth the squeeze?
Well, I think, about, the administration of ICER, if the therapy is not working, if it doesn't engraft, you'll know pretty quickly, right? And, so, I think, as I said, these outcomes-based agreements come in all shapes and sizes, right? In terms of duration, the types of outcomes that are being measured and stuff. But, I think certainly the risk to the payer, I mean, you'll know upfront very, very quickly, if the therapy is actually not working, through engraftment actually not taking place. So, I think that's what we've kind of sort of learned, from some of our experiences here.
Well, we're doing ICER, we're doing some policy work. A lot of people are in this area too. And, outcomes-based contracts sound like a great idea. And in some ways, they can help us try to address the uncertainty and the duration of the benefit or in the safety. And they also allow us to some extent to maybe pay in installments or to have some kind of rebate or warranty mechanism to improve affordability, or at least to improve the ability to spend over a smoother curve, which can help Medicaid programs, for instance, because it's hard for them to absorb the shock and awe of these big prices all at once. But we're all learning because a lot of these agreements are confidential, and it's hard to learn both clinically what we're learning from them and, if you will, financially, because the experiences are not being shared too much. So, Francis, I hope over time, and I know the payers are frequently the ones who want to keep the information confidential as much as you might, but I hope we can look to you to help us figure out how to learn over time from the experience that you're having with different types of payers around the world. All right, guys, this has been a fantastic, and I know I appreciate how superficial I've had to be in some of these areas as we went across so many different topics, but I wanted to thank you. And at the end of our policy roundtable, I'd like to invite each of you to have a final statement, if you will. Our tradition is to ask that it be one sentence with very strategically placed commas and maybe a semicolon, if you know how to use a semicolon these days. And this final statement can be either something that you've already said and you just want to make sure that we hear it one more time, I also would invite you to think of making a request of somebody else, represented at this table, the manufacturer, payers, patient groups, clinical experts. Feel free to make a request of any of them or multiple of them of what you think they should do to make the future work out right, the right way to apply the evidence, to generate it, to get the right patients treated in the right way, and obviously in some way with a value and affordability that will work for everybody. So the patients are going to get to say the last word on this. And again, thinking of it being one sentence, can I start with Julia?
Yeah, so I would echo Stephen and just say that payers are interested in the prospect of value-based contracts, especially for these expensive gene therapies, but we do need clearly measurable endpoints or outcomes in order for them to be of benefit to payers.
Thank you very much. Okay, Stephen, you're next.
I think it's rare that I walk away from a therapy impressed by the extent of benefit, but I think based on how the study and also the benefits that were demonstrated, I did want to express just my appreciation for that, as well as how it's designed and the clinical experts today. I think my request is that to keep doing what's already being done, to go beyond just the pivotal trial that only studies a very limited subset of the patient population, but to go beyond it as you are in, for instance, later onset disease.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephen. Francis, do you mind going next?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think, certainly I'd like to, on behalf of Orchard, certainly thank ICER actually for its, comprehensive clinical and economic review, certainly recognizing the value and transformational nature of Arcicel, and certainly everybody involved, today, the patient advocates, the expert clinicians, and also the members of the voting panel. I think we also are sort of very humbled that, some of the health economics research that's been presented today, which is patient and caregiver related, may have implications, for ICER assessments moving forward, in the gene therapy and rare diseases space, and that can only be good for the benefit of patients, right? Which is the ultimate objective.
Well, you were praising me, so I think that was more than one sentence, but I'll let you keep going, so that was okay. Thank you, by the way, I'll say it now for you and Francesca for being up very late in Europe. So thank you, and also to acknowledge the collaborative relationship that we had with Orchard as you shared information and perspectives on both methods and on the data. It was a very good relationship, and it helped make our report all the better. Thank you. Francesca, so I can help get you to bed too at some reasonable hour. Why don't you go next?
Thank you for asking. I want to ask to everybody at this roundtable to work to get access to the patient as soon as possible. I worked 20 years on MLD. I've lost many of my patients over years. In the meantime, I became also a mother, and I continue to treat patients like a mother also. And I work to have patients treated in few weeks from referrals. I did my best, but now is your turn to let this patient be treated, I think.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Taryn?
Well, we've come a long way through the years, and it's obvious that there's a lot of work yet to be done. Payer systems need to be worked on and in place now so that gene therapy can be offered to all babies diagnosed through newborn screening, no matter what their form of disease is, because it's pre-symptomatic is the best way to go and to end this disease once and for all.
Thank you. I just recognized that given my view screen, I forgot about Laura as a clinical expert too, and I will let Maria have the last word. So Laura, sorry, back over to you.
Yeah, so I think I'll end with a moment and thought of hope. We have the ability to change the world of MLD from a disease associated with the painful death in early childhood to one where we're going to identify families pre-symptomatically, and they'll never even know the journey that they escaped. And so I am incredibly hopeful for the future of this disease.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad you were able to join us this afternoon too for this part of the meeting. Thank you very much. Okay, Maria.
Wow. I understand profoundly what a heavy lift this drug therapy is. I understand that we are asking people to reimagine the entire paradigm for reimbursement, for diagnosis, for treatment. But MLD is worth it, and it will open up a new kind of medical revolution. So thank you for your leadership and vision on this challenging but exciting opportunity.
And thank you for the time and effort you've spent to educate us and to help us see, this situation from your perspective. It was priceless for us to benefit from that. Thank you all as a policy roundtable. You guys were fantastic. You've given us so much perspective, things we can add to the report that I really think will translate through and connect with payers and other policymakers, with researchers and others, again, not just with MLD, but with other situations like this. I'm going to hand it back over to the chair of the CTAF to lead them in their last statement. I hope the folks on the policy roundtable can stay to hear that. If you can, if it's late in Europe, I would certainly understand if you need to drop away. But Ralph, I'll hand it over to you, and then I'll have a very brief final comment at the very end. Ralph?
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. And I do like this particular last part of the session where people on our panel can have our chance for reflections using the Steve Pearson rule of a long run-on sentence to maximize such. So I'm going to start with Jeffrey Hodge.
Thank you. Before I give a customary, very brief summary, I'd just like to thank the clinical experts, the people with lived experience, for sharing their knowledge and their evidence that could inform our proceedings and make me feel that what we're doing is valuable and in line with doing things the right way. Okay, so Dr. Brindis, you wanted the brief summary. Here it is. 40 young children, promise of improved outcomes, how to compute worth.
As usual, you are a star. Jeffrey Klingman. Jeff.
Yes. Well, I have to just reflect on 30 years of practice. When I was in training, neurologists were known as people that admired diseases rather than treating them. And now we actually have things that we can do to cure. So it's just an incredible, incredible place to be where, I remember these people with MLD through the years and what a horrible disease process it was. And the idea that we can actually, just make it stop is incredible.
Thanks, Jeff. Bob Collier.
I'd like to reiterate everybody's support for the people that have been in front of us today. This is profoundly affecting for I think all of us, and how small this is, how big an impact we can show the system is capable of, at least possibly here. This is profoundly parallel to the Alzheimer's drugs and issues that we have done a couple years here, but it's powerfully different. And the optimism expressed here today is something that all of the rest of the disease groups should take away from this, and we should actually be more positive the way this meeting has actually felt. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Bob. Dr. Lee.
I was struck by, I tell my trainees that when you need a study of 5,000 people in each arm, that means that the benefits you're getting are tiny. And these results really show that when you have large effects, you can actually show they're very significant with just very small numbers. The only concern that I have is what I expressed earlier, which is that the data is really mostly from siblings, where we have a high likelihood that each of these kids are going to develop disease. And we are talking about expanding it to a much larger population. And I think it is incumbent on the manufacturer to show that even with this larger population, that we will continue to see this magnitude of benefit, because the data that we are seeing now really are truly impressive. And I think it gives me hope for the future that we are doing something right in medicine, continuing to find cures.
Thanks for your comments. Dr. Fox.
Thanks. I echo all of the things that have been said, and I would just, in my own words, I would say that, we have reviewed other gene therapies which have been extremely impressive, but I cannot imagine another disease other than MLD that would benefit more from gene therapy. So this has just been extremely eye-opening. And I do hope for the future that we also have early, effective, accurate screening. But very, very glad to participate in this, and thank you, everyone.
Dr. Kogut.
Thanks. Well, foremost to the parent, I don't have the right words to know what even to say, but thank you for helping us today. And also thinking, I'm glad we didn't have to take a vote on value today, because it seemed particularly unpleasant to think about a price for essentially saving the life of a child. But I also like how Steve Pearson pointed out the other side of that, which is rewarding innovation. So I think that's maybe a more sanguine way to think about it. So I understand why ICER strives to quantify value in terms of dollars, but still I'm glad we didn't have to vote on it today. Thanks.
Dr. Lowe.
It seems like a good day for optimists. So I'm seeing our biotechnology companies can create cures and not merely chronic treatments. ICER and healthcare technology assessment can give an A grade, which some people think can't happen. And these patients and parents who have suffered so much are really doing so much good for tomorrow's patients. So thank you all.
Mr. Kreese.
Thank you. I feel called to send out a message of love and solidarity to the MLD families I've met today from Cystic Fibrosis Nation, because you are where we were 60 years ago. And so I'm here from your future to echo the message of hope I heard from Dr. Adang. I was up to my neck in bringing newborn screening for CF to my state, and I am itching to see ICER help do the same for MLD now that you have what we're about to have, which is an effective gene therapy. So thank you.
Thanks, Don. Dr. Redberg.
I also think it was really moving and helpful to have the families and the caregivers and those perspectives and hear their stories. And it was fun to have the New England group join us today. And I also thought, although just to state, the principle is I prefer to have everyone, or as most of the people, particularly our clinical experts, without conflicts. I thought the woman from Italy was very thoughtful and scholarly, and she gave me a lot of confidence in the findings. And I would just say, I was thinking the same thing that I think Steve said when she was describing their process of who to administer the treatment to, and it really sounded thoughtful. Maybe I'm a little cynical, but I would say based on my experience, not sure that would happen in this country because other forces intervene that are not always for the patient benefit. But I appreciated all of the discussion, and it is very encouraging to see what seems to be such a promising therapy for a terrible, terrible, but rare disease.
And thanks, Rita. And our East Coast chair, Dr. Wasfi.
Thank you so much. And I guess with that, I'll say on behalf, as chair of New England CPAC, we're grateful to CTAF for hosting so many of us today. And here's to more collaboration ahead between the different independent review panels affiliated with ICER. I'd like to thank the ICER research staff for doing such a rigorous job as usual, all of the guests for their amazing testimony and richness that they've contributed to our deliberations today. And I know others have made this point, but I think it's worth making again, which is that, I'm here, I think we all have different expertise on these panels. I'm here because I'm a researcher and a cardiologist and a professor and an editor, but I'm also a father. And it's worth stating clearly that we acknowledge the tremendous suffering that this disorder has caused so many of you moms and dads. These precious, precious little children deserve so much better than what they have. And I'm just so glad that there's at least a step in the right direction. I just want you all to know how deeply we respect your experience and value your contributions. And thank you for giving back so much, especially under the circumstances that you faced.
Spoken like an incredible East Coast chair. Thanks, Jason. I also want to thank the MLD parents who came today and sharing your valuable perspectives with CTAF. And I think what we've learned, at least at CTAF for a last couple of sessions we've had, is that technological advances of gene therapy is being increasingly proven to be the innovative, disruptive treatment which patients, families, and the healthcare professionals have been hoped for. Nowhere can it have been shown more today than in the disease of MLD. I also want to thank the ICER staff. I want to thank Grace and all the people involved with the reports. But I also want to acknowledge Orchard Therapeutics for its effort in addressing therapy for a very rare, devastating disease. Companies always look at the bottom line, and to take on a very small, devastating disease with a very low incidence is worth mentioning. So, Steve, back to you for closing remarks.
No, thank you, Ralph, and thanks for a great job as chair today. We have meetings where we really touch a lot of emotional depths, and this was one of those. The parents were just heartbreaking in a lot of ways for especially maybe even more for those of us who are parents. It reminded me of some work we did on just the general idea of cures or potential cures, transformative treatments. Let's use that term. And I remember in a room once, and I raised the question, what's different about these treatments in the way that we need to look at their evidence or deal with them in whatever way it is? And there was a very short moment of silence. And then a clinician raised her hand, and I said yes. And she said, we have to provide them. There's this, and by we, she meant all of us. And this was a room with manufacturers and insurers and clinical experts. The idea is that when we have the opportunity to have a treatment like this, we have to provide them. And that creates both an ethical kind of sense of momentum and optimism, but it creates a huge amount of responsibility on everybody. And Orchard hasn't named its price yet, but let's be honest, the right price is not $100 million, right? It's with everything we heard today, it's not right to price this at $100 million. So how do we decide what it means when we have to provide it and the company that has created it gets to tell us how much it costs? That's a tough situation for everybody. So the company itself has to obviously show a lot of consideration for the broader picture. And it means that we have to think very carefully about how we find that balance. Don Kreese will remember, the CF community will remember when we looked at treatments there, we said, look, the goal here is not to have a haggling process where insurers say, well, we might not cover it unless you do a lower price, or we might not cover it for everybody who could benefit unless you give us a lower price. That works in some drug areas, but it doesn't work for something like this. We don't want our representatives to haggle over, when we know for whom this treatment can work, haggle over whether they get it or not. We want them to take action to make sure that they get it. And yet we need some process for thinking about what a fair price would be to keep the balance so that everybody can afford it, and that we have the opportunity to handsomely reward the next treatment like this that comes along. So my request, my last comment, which I know is a lot longer than one sentence, is to ask for everybody to accept their responsibility. Insurers, clinical experts, patient community still has, responsibility to speak up to those I know in powerful positions, as you have done beautifully today, and to the manufacturer to exercise the restraint and the magnificent sense of responsibility that you now have to bring this forward in a way that is responsible for our healthcare system. So I'm very optimistic that that can happen, but I think we all have to hold each other accountable. And today's been a really important part of our effort to do that, to have us all at the table speaking as honestly as we can about these issues. So my great thanks to the Policy Roundtable, my immense thanks to certainly my own staff at ICER, and to all of you. I hope that you've left with some hope here about the fact that we can do this right if we do it together. So thank you, and we'll look forward to putting out our final report in just a few weeks, and with working with all of you to make sure that some of these ideas and recommendations really do translate through to a better future. Thanks, everybody.